Marshall, Will, and Holly on a routine expedition met the greatest earthquake ever known. High on the rapids, they struck their tiny raft and plunged them down 1,000 feet below to the land of the lost.
Land of the Lost was a Saturday morning children's program that aired on NBC from 1974 until 1976, following the adventures of Rick Marshall and his two kids Will and Holly, who end up stranded on the mysterious Land of the Lost after falling off of a waterfall. The show was one of a kind, as it was a children's live-action sci-fi adventure program that utilized stop-motion, puppets, and chroma keying to create this Land of the Lost and all of its creatures. So why did I decide to watch this strange show that was meant for kids and first aired over 25 years before I was even born? One time, when I was really young, me and my sister were scrolling through the TV trying to find something to watch, and we stumbled upon a marathon of Land of the Lost episodes. We watched a ton of them, and we laughed so hard at this joke in particular.
What the fish?
I watched about 6 episodes one time when I was 8 years old, and ever since then, I have permanently had Land of the Lost filed away in my brain. And now I have the honor to teach all of you about this really strange show that 48 years ago went from the highest rated NBC children's show to a forgotten classic. The show was created by Sid and Marty Krofft, kind of. These were the guys that were practically running children's TV during the 70s. They had hit shows like H.R. Pufnstuf, Lidsville, and Sigmund and the Sea Monsters. All 3 of those are really weird shows, and I watched some episodes preparing for this video, but they were very successful. So when Planet of the Apes hit, and Star Trek at the same time was getting like this large cult following, networks were on the look for space travel shows. They wanted to see characters that could travel through space and had heavy makeup production. In the book Sid and Marty Krofft, A Critical Study of Saturday Morning Children's Television, it is said that NBC was looking for someone to create a caveman dinosaur show. And since Hanna-Barbera already had a show of that description on CBS called Valley of the Dinosaurs, they turned to the other kings of children's television, the Kroffts. Sid and Marty Krofft had a firm grasp on what it meant to make great children's television, or at least popular children's television, but they were a bit out of their element when it came to writing sci-fi, so they hired someone who could help them. They enlisted the help of Star Trek writing alumni David Gerrold. David was most famous for creating the Trouble with Tribbles episode of Star Trek. He created the lore of the island, all of the characters that are introduced within the first season, and he brought in all of his Star Trek writing buddies to help write the episodes for the first season. While the Kroffts produced the show and really got the ball rolling on production, it was David who really created the Land of the Lost. He created a show about a family stuck in a mysterious place and an overarching story of learning all of the mysteries of this place while trying to find a way home. Does that sound familiar? Now that they had a Land of the Lost, it was time to fill it with characters, starting with the father of the family, Rick Marshall. Rick Marshall was a park ranger who was taking his 2 kids on a kayaking trip when he fell off of a waterfall and landed in the Land of the Lost. Rick was a classic TV dad. He taught his kids morals and taught them about survival and life lessons while they were stuck on this Land of the Lost. Also, Rick had no problem rolling up his sleeves, and when it was time for action, he was ready to throw hands. Well, there was actually a strong push against violence in children's television during the 70s, and so he never actually threw hands per se. It was more of just like a lot of pushing and shoving. Rick Marshall was played by actor Spencer Milligan, who was an unknown character actor who, before getting the part in Land of the Lost, only had like a small part in a Woody Allen movie. When doing research for this, there's not a lot of information about Milligan. Most of the stuff that I hear are just stories from other cast members of the Land of the Lost during panels and stuff. The cool thing was he just really didn't seem to care how important the producers or the directors were. Like, if he had a problem, he would handle it, which is foreshadowing, by the way. While Rick was a large part of the show, almost even more important were his two children, Will and Holly. Will is 16 when they end up on the Land of the Lost, and his character consists of being this headstrong, stubborn teenager who plays the harsh older brother of Holly. He's always getting into wacky situations because he either thinks he can handle them himself or he doesn't listen to instruction. What's really interesting to me about this character is that in the 70s, he was probably super cool. However, watching it now, he's kind of a like, he has his moments, like when he helps his sister or his dad, or when he makes a really heartwarming decision, but for the most part, he's pretty rude to everyone except for his dad. The character of Will is played by actor Wesley Ure, who is the most famous of the original cast. While he played Will on Land of the Lost, he was simultaneously on the very popular soap opera, The Days of Our Lives. In fact, he would record Land of the Lost in the mornings and then go over and do Days of Our Lives in the evenings. He also went on to become a mainstay on popular game shows like Password and Match Game, and he even hosted the Nickelodeon game show Finders Keepers. Oh, but Wesley was not just an actor and a teen heartthrob. Oh no, he was also a singer. He actually sings the Land of the Lost theme song that you heard a little bit of at the beginning of this video. And the coolest thing about his singing career is that he used to sing with the Jackson 5. And also something that I thought was really cool, it doesn't really have anything to do with singing or acting, but he co-created the children's show Dragon Tales, which was like my favorite show as a kid. Anyway, that's Will. Holly Marshall is the youngest member of the Marshall family, and she's really the driving force of this show. While I think most shows of the time period used the little sister character as like a damsel in distress in adventure shows, Holly, more often than not, actually saves the day. That being said, she's still super whiny and annoying, and she cries all the time.
Go on. Well, go on. I don't want you anymore. Go with the other dinosaurs. Go on, get out of here. I don't want you anymore. Just get going. Get out of here. Get out of here. Do you hear me? I don't want you anymore. Get out of here. Get out of here. Go on. Go with the other dinosaurs.
Which, to be fair, is really good acting, and it really sells the danger at parts. Like, while watching all 3 seasons, I would forget how scary it would be to be chased by a giant T-Rex, because it literally happens all the time. But when you have Holly sobbing and crying and grabbing her dad, being like, "Daddy, Daddy," it reminds you that, yo, it's probably pretty terrifying. And when I mean they get chased by a T-Rex all the time, I mean like every episode. The character of Holly is played by actress Kathy Coleman, who before she got the part did some small TV and commercial stuff, but after she got the part, pretty much retired from acting altogether. She still hangs around and she does a lot of the Land of the Lost conferences and panels and stuff at Comic-Cons, but other than an autobiography that she released in 2015, not much. Now that you know the characters, let's get into the first season of this show. A season that I would consider a masterpiece. Season 1 of Land of the Lost starts with the episode Chaka, which not only goes into more detail about how the Marshalls ended up on the island, but it introduces 2 of the most important characters that we're going to see in the first season of Land of the Lost. The first being the giant T-Rex that I was talking about that chases them every single episode. In the first episode, Holly nicknames the T-Rex Grumpy, as she does with all of the creatures and dinosaurs that she finds. She gives them cute little nicknames, and it's actually really cute. I'm not gonna lie, I like it a lot. The creation of Grumpy is actually like really cool. Like, for the most part, the special effects in this show suck like really bad, but the stop motion, it holds up. I mean, really put into perspective the year 1974 and look at this stop motion dinosaur. This is 20 years before Jurassic Park came out. In fact, the whole show's production kind of relies on technology that just wasn't quite there yet. I mean, the worst part of this show is the chroma keying, like the blue screens that they used. It looks really bad, but you gotta remember, like, that technology really wasn't there yet. Like, when 70s kids saw this stuff, it probably blew their mind. And even when I watched it as a kid, I didn't recognize that it was fake. Like, I was watching it like they were real dinosaurs. But to be fair, I was a pretty dumb kid. All of the stop motion and miniatures in this first season were done by Gene Warren Jr. The studio paid him $100,000 for 40 minutes of stop motion for the first season. And since they only had 40 minutes of stop motion footage for the whole first season, it was up to the writers and directors to really get creative on how they can reuse this footage over and over and over again, like we see with Grumpy the T-Rex. That footage of Grumpy being outside the cave is used in pretty much every single episode. This episode also introduced creatures called the Pakuni. Remember when I said that the show wanted something like Planet of the Apes? Well, the Pakuni are the apes. And we're introduced to the Pakuni through the youngest of the family of Pakuni, Chaka. If this show is Family Matters, then Chaka is like the Urkel. Like, he's not the main character, he just pops in every episode for the fun adventures that take place. And between you and me, much like how Steve Urkel is the most popular character on that show, I think Chaka is the best character on this show. Chaka really loves the Marshalls, especially Holly, and he's always willing to help them out, and vice versa. When he's scared or doesn't know what's going on, he runs straight to the Marshalls' cave and is like, help. It's really wholesome. Chaka is played by Philip Paley, who rose to fame because he was the youngest black belt in the world. He was 9 years old and he was showing up on The Tonight Show with Chuck Norris, who trained him, and that's how he got the part on this show. And frankly, he killed it. One of the coolest parts about the Pakuni in this show is that they speak their own language. The show actually hired a linguist named Victoria Fromkin, and she created a big dictionary full of all these words and phrases in the Pakuni language. The goal of the Pakuni language was to introduce it slowly throughout the first season, so that way the Marshalls would slowly learn the language and be able to communicate with Chaka and the other Pakuni. But the really cool thing about it is that it also allowed the audience to kind of learn the language throughout. And some popular phrases actually hit pop culture in the 70s and 80s. Personally, I think they handled it super well. Like, one of my favorite parts of the show was watching how the Marshalls slowly learned the Pakuni language, and vice versa, Chaka learned to speak English. It wasn't an overnight thing, like one episode they didn't understand him and the next they did. Like, a big problem through some of these episodes were trying to translate what Chaka and the Pakuni were trying to say. The second episode of season 1 introduced the big villains of the series called the Sleestack. The Sleestack were these like lizard type humanoid creatures, and they're probably the most popular thing to come out of Land of the Lost. An overview of what the Sleestack are: they're afraid of the light, so they only come out at night to hunt for this moth that gives them nutrients for their eggs or whatever. They're very violent and aggressive creatures. They also see the Marshalls as like intruders on their land, and so they're always out to get them. The Sleestack live in what the Marshalls call the Lost City, which is like the ruins of this old city where the Sleestack live in underground tunnels. Underground tunnels that the Marshalls have to visit frequently in order to try to find their way home, and so they're always getting kidnapped by the Sleestack. Like I was saying about violence in children's television, they couldn't really show it. So what they would do is they would kidnap the Marshalls, put them in a big net, and threaten to sacrifice them to their Sleestack god. Thankfully, they always managed to escape right before they got sacrificed to the Sleestack god. Another fun fact about the Sleestacks were they could only afford 3 outfits. So although it's implied that there's like 8,000 Sleestack, you only see 3 at a time on screen. Another cool thing about the Sleestacks is they're super tall, so they casted college basketball players to play them. And Bill Laimbeer from the Detroit Pistons, he actually played a Sleestack throughout season 1. The whole first season is about introducing different elements of the Land of the Lost in an organic way, so that way we're learning at the same time as the Marshalls about where they are and how are they going to leave. In episode 3, we find out that the river just circles around. There's no way for them to leave like through the ocean or something. Also in episode 3, we learn that there's a Confederate soldier hidden in the caves underneath the river, and like he has a cannon. And I think it's really funny how like he doesn't leave. Like at the end of the episode, he's just like, I'm gonna stay in my cave, you guys have fun out there. And then they just never mention him again. So like all of these crazy events that happen in the next 3 seasons, I'm always like, I wonder what the Confederate soldier's doing underground right now. Is he even alive? Is he dead? The next big introduction of the island comes in episode 6, called The Stranger. This is where we meet the character Enoch. Now, Enoch looks like a Sleestack, but he can actually talk and he's very intelligent. And in this episode, he helps teach the Marshals about what the Land of the Lost really is. And therefore, we finally learn what the Land of the Lost really is. We learn that the Land of the Lost is actually the planet Altrusia, and Enoch is an Altrusian. The planet is a staging area for traveling between worlds and times. So the only way in and out of the Land of the Lost is through something called a time doorway. And time doorways are how the Marshals got there when they fell off the waterfall. Enoch's theory is that he fell through a time doorway and he ended up going into the way deep Neanderthal past of Altrusia. And since it's so prehistoric, he's like, oh, well, this is my ancestors, the Sleestack, and they're very aggressive and violent, but eventually they get smart like me. But in this episode, we find out that he didn't go to the past. Enoch actually went to the future. This is what his people become. And a big problem for Enoch as a character is that he needs to get home now so that he can warn his people what they're going to become if they don't do something different. This episode is really where the first season and the show itself really turns around and turns into what the show is. The beginning episodes kind of drag and they're hokey and cheesy, but this episode where we start learning about what the Land of the Lost really is, we start getting into the lore of the island, it gets good. And within these next few episodes, the dialogue gets a lot better too. Like, there's some jokes that I actually laugh at. And it's through these next few episodes we learn more about Chaka and Enoch. Which, by the way, Enoch, much like Will, is kind of a and while the show is about family and it does a great job of showing a dynamic of a family lost and trying to work together to get back home, it's at its best when it's going into the deep lore and inner workings of the Land of the Lost. And the greatest example of that is in episode 13, where the Marshals find this old lost journal of someone who used to be stuck on the Land of the Lost. This journal belongs to these dudes that are stuck on the Land of the Lost, and it's a deeply detailed journey on how they got off the island. And so the Marshals get super excited and they're following the steps in this journal and they think that they're going to get home. At the end of the journal, he says, I'm going through this doorway now. I'm leaving this journal behind in hopes that whoever finds it can follow in our footsteps and get home too. And so the Marshals go through the door and it's a lava pit. Luckily, they escape, of course. This episode had real stakes and like a true B-plot. And it was like this episode where the show really felt like a modern TV show. And this episode had like some big payoffs of some like long arcing story stuff that they had established in the first few episodes. So it felt like really good long form storytelling. Next up is the season 1 finale, Circle. Circle is, in my opinion, the best episode in the entire show. The showrunner and creator, David Gerrold, wasn't sure if the show was going to get picked up for season 2, so he wanted to make sure that the season 1 finale was a satisfying ending for the audience if it didn't get picked up, while also having the opportunity to keep going if they did get picked up. And he did this by creating a paradox. We learned that the Marshals weren't supposed to come to the Land of the Lost. They were supposed to die in that waterfall. When they entered the Land of the Lost broke. I had mentioned before that the Land of the Lost is supposed to be this staging area for people to get between worlds and times. So people like Enoch should be able to come and go to the different worlds and the different times as they please. But when the Marshals broke the Land of the Lost, it made it to where no one can leave. The only way that they can do it is by creating a paradox. The 3 of them can't leave unless 3 other people take their place. That's the established rules of the broken Land of the Lost. So they decide if the 3 of them go through the time doorway to go home, they will replace themselves with themselves. The themselves that are currently falling to their death in the waterfall, which reveals to the audience and to them that the only reason that they ended up in the Land of the Lost in the first place was so that they could leave the Land of the Lost. So the season 1 finale really just explained everything. They said that the only reason that the Marshals went to the Land of the Lost was because the Marshals needed to get off of the Land of the Lost, and it's a constant cycle that should be never ending. A really cool touch about the finale is that the end of the episode is the beginning of the first episode, showing that it's a loop. That's not only just a really cool storytelling device, it's genius for marketing, because in theory, you could just keep playing reruns over and over and over. However, they do get picked up for season 2, and I was so invested. I had so many questions about how season 2 is going to work. Like, is it going to be a repeat of season 1, but they have free will, so they're able to make their own decisions, and so they're making different decisions than what we saw in season 1? Or does something go wrong in the events? They don't actually get to go home. They don't get to break the paradox, and so maybe they keep going. Like, what is it? How is... And when the season 1 finale ended, there was no doubt in my mind that this show was awesome, and I could not wait to start watching season 2. And then I started watching season 2. Okay, here's some backstory about season 2 before we get into season 2. The showrunner and pretty much creator, David, we know David, well, he left the show, and so did most of the writers. However, the show was a hit now. In an interview, it was said that the show was doing pretty well for the first episode, but the second that the Sleestaks hit TV, they became the #1 show on NBC Saturday mornings. The show's a big hit, the show's a big moneymaker, so they upgrade their very small budget for season 1, which was $35,000 an episode. The cast and crew were working for base pay, and they didn't even get meals. But now, they're the #1 show, they're making a killing out of merchandising, and there is so much merchandising. Look at my shirt. And although they're making all this money in merchandising, they're still not paying the cast very much, which is foreshadowing, by the way. So for season 2, they lost a lot of the writing that made season 1 so great. But in return, they had a higher budget, and so they upgraded the visual effects a good bit. Like this dope-ass dinosaur fight that goes on for the whole episode. I'm not kidding. This whole episode is just these dinosaurs fighting. It was like watching King Kong versus Godzilla. It was awesome. Season 2 also sees a big drop off on the long arcing storylines, like how we got in season 1. It becomes a lot more episodic in nature. We're essentially just getting one episode stories where Chaka and the Marshals are trying to solve a problem, which can be done really well. For example, in the first episode of season 2, there's this baby dinosaur in the show that Holly has nicknamed Dopey, and Holly's kind of adopted this baby dinosaur as a pet. But Dopey gets trapped in the tar pits, and it looks like he's going to drown to death. But Chaka, the greatest character on this show, is determined to save him. It's a really beautiful episode that had me in my feelings. It was in this episode that I really realized that it didn't matter that the visual effects sucked and that the writing could be pretty subpar and that there's a lot of inconsistencies in the story, because I just love these characters so much. I was invested, and no matter what, no matter how bad this show got, I was going to keep watching because I loved the Marshals and especially Chaka. So, like I said, season 2 became very episodic in nature, and they never explained how it worked. Because in the season 1 finale, we saw the loop, we saw the paradox be created. So, how is there a season 2 where they don't even mention it? So now the Marshals need to find a new way home, which they do in season 2, episode 8. In this episode, they find a special time doorway that only opens every 3 or 4 years. And this doorway allows them to get home, but the only issue is they got separated. Will and Rick are together, and then Holly is by herself. Will and Rick are in this pylon, which is the time doorway mechanisms, and they could go home, but they don't want to leave the youngest of their family, the little sister, the youngest daughter, in the Land of the Lost by herself. So they go back. At the same time, Holly can go home, but she realizes that if she goes home, she's leaving her dad and her brother in the Land of the Lost, and so she decides to go back. And the saddest part about this is if they all had acted selfishly, they would all be together at home. the coolest thing about this episode for me is that the subtext is they have a way home now. It just takes 3 or 4 years for it to open back up. And since this show doesn't actually get a proper finale with the Marshals making their way home, I'm going to use this episode as assurance that they do. To be quite honest, most of this season is pretty boring. Some quick highlights, there's like the best looking shot cinematography wise. Oh, and then there's the funniest episode, which is episode 9, where Chaka is just a savage, bro. And I was like genuinely laughing at parts. Like, this episode also has my favorite joke from childhood that I played earlier. You remember.
Fish.
Huh?
What the fish? There's a fish!
Hey, Chaka! Chaka, it's my fishing boat!
And even though the most of this season is pretty boring and episodic in nature, the last 3 episodes really heat up. Like, they find an ancient temple that used to belong to somebody. Chaka learns how to play the flute. There's a bunch of like doppelgangers of the Marshals that they have to try to help get back home, assumingly because of the paradox. I don't quite know. All leading up to this big finale where it's the Marshals versus a ton of Sleestacks, but you only see 3 in the frame at a time, remember? Because the Sleestack have found a way to make it dark forever. So in their mind, they can hunt forever. So while season 2 wasn't quite as good as season 1, it was still a pretty good follow-up for season 1, and if it had ended with that finale of season 2, Land of the Lost would go down in history of one of the most perfect shows to ever happen in television. And then they got renewed for season 3. Hey, remember that foreshadowing I was telling you guys about? In season 3, the actor who plays Rick, Spencer Milligan, left the show because of a disagreement about the merchandising. He felt like since his face and the children's face were all over all this merchandising, they should be getting a cut. And they said no, and so he left. So the loss of Rick is a big blow because the dad character really tied it all together. But an even bigger blow is the fact that every single writer and director that was involved with season 1 and 2 were gone for season 3. Like, even Sid and Marty Krofft had stepped down from like really producing the show. Like, they were still like the money guys and it was still their show, but they were really hands-off because they were busy with a lot of other stuff. Season 3 is filled with a ton of information that is directly contradictory with canon that was set in the first 2 seasons. They make a bunch of weird changes, like making the Sleestack speak English, but I think the hardest part for me was the replacement of Rick with Rick's brother, Uncle Jack. In the first episode of season 3, they use a body double to explain that Rick was standing near a time doorway when an earthquake hit, and he accidentally fell through the time doorway and went back home without his children. But luckily, at the same exact time, his brother, Jack, who had been looking for the Marshals for the whole 6 months since they've disappeared, fell through the same time doorway at the waterfall, and he ends up in the Land of the Lost. And Jack just like isn't Rick. The family dynamic, the chemistry is just not there. Oh, and somehow the special effects got worse? A show that was already not necessarily very good got really, really bad. If the whole show had been season 3, like the quality and the writing and the special effects, like I don't think I would have made it past a few episodes. After watching this whole show and doing a ton of research, watching a bunch of interviews, reading a ton of reviews, I have decided that I love The Land of the Lost. Like, I cannot stress to you how popular that show was in the 70s and then again in the 80s when reruns were playing. They sold a ton of merchandising and the theme song is so catchy, it has to be one of the best theme songs. I say that Land of the Lost is a forgotten classic, but it has been revitalized a few times. Like, they tried to do a reboot show on Nickelodeon and then the 2009 movie with Will Ferrell. Like, when I looked up season 1 on Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 100%, and it's because there's only 5 reviews. I highly recommend watching this show on YouTube, especially if you have kids. They're free to watch. They're all on YouTube, and your kids will genuinely be scared of the Sleestack, and they will genuinely love Chaka and the Marshals, and that's how I feel about The Land of the Lost.
Marshall, Will, and Holly on a routine expedition met the greatest earthquake ever known. High on the rapids, it struck their tiny raft